Today's deep dive starts with a premise that sounds almost like a total contradiction.
Right, because we are looking at a foundational text that literally billions of people read every single day.
Yeah, yet somehow the most surprising details inside it remain almost completely hidden from our mainstream cultural discourse.
It really is wild when you think about what's actually in there.
I mean, we're talking about miracles performed by Jesus that most people have absolutely no idea are recorded in the Quran.
Yep.
And like a literally biological interpretation of God's love that shifts theology out of the clouds and straight into human cells.
So the source material we are examining today to understand all of this is a transcript from a YouTube interview series. It's titled, Let's Discover God Together.
Which is a pretty straightforward setup, but an unusual one, right?
Exactly. The host is a Christian named Steve Reed, and he sits down for this really extended conversation with Safi Kaskas.
And Safi is an 82-year-old Muslim scholar, a business consultant, and a translator.
He brings such a unique perspective. Our mission today is to dig into the primary texts they discuss.
Right, we want to move past the secondary sources, the commentary and the media spin that you always hear.
Yeah, we're looking directly at the source code of these beliefs.
Exactly. The goal is to uncover these totally unexpected overlaps and, of course, the profound philosophical divergences between two of the world's largest religions.
Especially regarding human nature, divine mercy, and honestly, just how we interact with our neighbors.
Okay, let's unpack this, because to understand how Safi approaches translating one of the most scrutinized texts in human history, we really have to look at the environment that shaped his worldview.
Yeah, you have to look at his roots. He grew up in Beirut, Lebanon.
Right. But as a teenager, his primary intellectual outlet was actually the local U.S. Embassy Library.
Which is so interesting. He spent his time there reading American newspapers, cartoons, and literally studying the U.S. Constitution.
Just hanging out at the embassy, reading the Constitution. And the draw wasn't just the political framework of some distant nation.
Oh, it was deeper than that. While he was reading those materials in Beirut, he encountered this specific phrase describing the United States as a country of neighbors.
Country of neighbors. I love that phrasing.
Right. That concept, a society bound not by ethnic homogeneity or like ancient tribal lines, but just by the shared agreement to be neighbors, it became this defining ideal for him.
And he actually put that ideal to the test.
Yeah.
He moved to the U.S. in 1969.
Yep. Settled down in the South. In Alabama, specifically.
By Alabama.
Yeah.
And he notes in the interview that he experienced that country of neighbors reality firsthand.
He states pretty plainly that he wouldn't have even survived those early years without the direct help of the people living around him.
So that abstract concept from the embassy library became a lived, practical reality for him.
Exactly. And that practical reality becomes the lens through which he processes the aftermath of 9/11.
Oh, wow.
Yeah.
Because that event completely fractured the concept of the American neighborhood for a lot of people.
It really did. It created this massive wedge of fear, suspicion, and misunderstanding regarding Islam.
And the instinct for a lot of people in his position might be to retreat, right? Or just react defensively to that massive shift in the cultural climate.
But Safis took a completely different approach. He channeled his energy into translating the Quran.
And the method of his translation is what really matters here, I think.
Yeah, he didn't produce some dense academic volume layered with, archaic terminology that no one uses anymore.
No, he translated it into simple, contemporary, high school level English.
Specifically targeting American youth.
Which is such a brilliant strategy. It
Yeah.
operates a lot like open sourcing a complex software code,
Oh, that's a great way to look at it.
Like, historically, the code of a major faith is incredibly dense. It's guarded by this specialized class of scholars and theologians who basically act as gatekeepers.
Right. They tell the public what the code does rather than letting them see it.
It's exactly. But Safi essentially strips away the complex syntax, publishes the raw source code in plain English, and tells the user to just run the program themselves to see the output.
The underlying logic of that choice is fascinating. He operated on the premise that if you provide young people with the text in a language they actually natively understand, they have the capacity to investigate it and draw their own conclusions.
Yeah, removing those intermediary layers, the media spin, the extreme interpretations, the academic gatekeeping.
And he even went a step further in removing those barriers.
What did he do?
He eventually published a version of the Quran that included over 3,000 references to the Old and New Testaments.
Wow, over 3,000.
Yeah. He recognized that to effectively communicate with an American audience, he needed to establish a bridge to the cultural and religious touchstones they already possessed.
So he's highlighting the shared architecture between all these texts.
Exactly. And the architecture they share brings up a figure that most people would honestly never expect to be the focal point of a Quranic translation aimed at Americans.
Right, because you might assume the focus would be heavily on the Prophet Muhammad.
But Safi, instead, highlights the profound role of Jesus.
Yes.
What's fascinating here is the sheer volume of text and the level of reverence dedicated to both Jesus and his mother Mary within the Quran.
I mean, to put it in perspective for you, Mary is the only woman mentioned by name in the entire Quran.
The only one.
And there is literally an entire chapter named after her.
The text elevates them to an incredibly high esteem, which contradicts that super common assumption that Islam merely views Jesus as like a minor historical prophet.
The scale of the reverence becomes crystal clear when you look at the specific miracles the text attributes to him.
Yeah, the Quran explicitly affirms the virgin birth, stating it occurred through the Holy Spirit.
It documents Jesus healing diseases, raising the dead.
But the miracle that stands out most, because it is completely absent from mainstream Christian texts, is the narrative of Jesus speaking as an infant.
Like a literal baby?
Less than a day old.
That is wild. The mechanics of that specific narrative are just striking. According to the text, Mary returns to her community carrying the newborn Jesus.
Right, and the community is completely scandalized, obviously, believing she has committed this grave sin since she was known to be a virgin.
And she is divinely instructed not to speak in her own defense.
Right. Yeah. She is told to simply point to the infant.
Just point to the baby.
And then the newborn Jesus speaks. He announces himself as a servant of the Creator, effectively defending his mother's honor and totally neutralizing the scandal.
Safi also underscores a definitive theological title here, too. Jesus is the only person referred to as the Messiah, or the Christ, in the entire Quran.
The only one.
Here's where it gets really interesting. Yeah. We have 2 billion Christians and nearly 2 billion Muslims living on the same planet right now.
Right.
If Jesus holds this central role in the Quran, if he's the only Messiah, and if his mother is the most revered woman in the text, we have to ask why this massive theological overlap is completely missing from our global cultural discourse.
It's a huge blind spot. And the absence of that information points directly to how human societies manage and honestly weaponize information.
How so?
Well, highlighting differences serves distinct political, territorial, and social functions, right? Conflict is a much more effective driver of narrative cohesion than harmony is.
Oh, absolutely. If a society emphasizes that the quote-unquote other side actually reveres its most sacred historical figures, the ideological boundaries that maintain social order start to dissolve.
Exactly. The people drawing the lines lose their authority.
It benefits the gatekeepers to keep the populations reading the commentary rather than the source text.
Definitely. But, we shouldn't pretend the texts are just a perfect mirror image of one another either.
Right.
Yeah.
As Safi points out, there's a fundamental theological divergence between the two faiths.
It just doesn't center on the identity of Jesus.
It centers on the identity of humanity. It's about human nature and the concept of the fall.
If we connect this to the bigger picture, this is where we see a really stark contrast in foundational psychology.
Yeah, because in mainstream Christian theology, the narrative of Adam and Eve in the Garden of Eden is traditionally interpreted as a catastrophic failure.
Right. The consumption of the fruit introduces sin into the world, which results in this permanently fractured human condition.
This is the doctrine of original sin.
Yeah.
The idea that humanity literally inherits a broken nature.
But Safi clarifies that the Quranic narrative contains no concept of original sin.
Not at all.
None. There is no inherited brokenness, and humanity is not viewed as fallen.
That completely alters the psychological baseline of the believer, doesn't it?
Completely. Because in the Quran, the creation narrative involves God informing the angels that he's placing humans on earth and breathing his spirit into them.
And that breath is the mechanism of human consciousness.
Exactly. So the Garden of Eden, in this framework, was never designed to be a test of perfect obedience. Safi describes it instead as a workshop.
A workshop designed to teach humanity how to use the single most dangerous and defining tool they were ever given, which is free will.
Yes. If you have the ability to choose, you have to understand the mechanics of consequences.
It operates exactly like a modern flight simulator, right?
Yeah.
You don't put a pilot in a real plane for their very first lesson.
No, because the inevitable crash would be fatal.
Exactly. The Garden of Eden was a simulator. God placed Adam in an environment where he could exercise his free will, make the inevitable wrong choice by eating the fruit, and experience the consequence without destroying the actual world.
And the critical component of the simulator analogy is the aftermath of the crash.
What happens next?
When Adam makes the wrong choice in the Quranic narrative, it doesn't permanently stain all future generations.
Right, it is simply the first instance of a human being experiencing the friction of free will.
Realizing a mistake was made, feeling that inherent guilt of consciousness, and actively choosing to ask for forgiveness.
And crucially, God forgives him immediately.
Immediately. The system didn't break. The system functioned exactly as it was engineered to function.
Humans are designed with the capacity to choose, the inevitability of making errors, the consciousness to recognize those errors, and the ability to course correct.
Safi argues that sinning and seeking forgiveness is not a glitch in human nature. It is a feature of our perfection.
We are exactly what we were meant to be, engaging in this continuous loop of learning.
And that framework reshapes how the believer perceives the divine gaze. If humanity is not inherently broken, the divine isn't viewing human actions through this lens of perpetual disappointment or anger.
The dynamic shifts to something closer to a parent watching a child learn to walk.
Yeah, the child falling is not a moral failure. It is just a necessary mechanical step in learning balance.
And the parental response to the fall is not condemnation, but mercy.
Which brings us to exactly how God responds to this inherent human vulnerability. Safi and Steve transition into this linguistic analysis of God's love.
And the biological implications of this analysis completely reframe the concept of divine mercy.
Steve Reed initiates this part by bringing up the Greek word agape.
Right, which is the standard term used in Christian theology to describe God's unconditional self-sacrificial love for humanity.
It represents the highest form of love, totally free from earthly conditions.
But Safi counters by looking at the actual linguistic reality of the region. Jesus did not speak Greek, right? His native language was Aramaic.
Which operates basically as a sibling language to Arabic.
So Safi asked a really practical question. What word would Jesus have actually used in his own language to articulate this concept of ultimate divine love?
And Safi points to the Arabic word Rama, which translates broadly to ultimate mercy.
It is the foundational term in Islam, appearing at the very beginning of almost every single chapter of the Quran to describe the primary characteristic of God as the giver of mercy.
But the profound part is the actual etymology of the word. Safi explains that the linguistic root of Rama consists of the exact same 3 letters used to form the Arabic word for a mother's womb.
Wait, really? The same word root?
The exact same root. By linking divine mercy directly to the concept of a womb, the text takes something that Greek philosophy treats as a highly abstract, theoretical, ideal-like agape, and grounds it in the most physical, visceral reality of human existence.
The Creator is explicitly comparing his mercy toward humanity to the environment in which a mother gestates a child.
Yes.
So what does this all mean in practical terms? Well, Safi uses modern biology to explain the depth of this linguistic connection, which blew my mind.
It's incredible. During pregnancy, this biological phenomenon occurs where a mother retains cells from her developing baby within her own body.
And those cells remain in her tissue, her organs, and her bloodstream for the rest of her life.
The connection between mother and child is not merely an intense emotional bond. It is a permanent cellular integration.
This raises an important question about how the translation of a single word can dictate an entire theology.
Oh, absolutely. Because when the abstract concept of divine goodwill is replaced by the biological reality of the womb, the relationship between the human and the divine becomes deeply intimate.
It suggests a love that physically surrounds the individual, provides an environment for growth, and maintains a permanent cellular connection regardless of the individual's actions.
It completely transforms theology from this intellectual exercise into a biological absolute.
It is a stunning way to look at our relationship with the universe. But, as compelling as this theological and linguistic harmony is, the conversation and the source material inevitably descends from those theoretical clouds down to the messy, concrete reality of human history.
Yeah, it gets heavy. Safi and Sprave spent a significant portion of the interview discussing modern geopolitics.
Right, and before we analyze this section, it's strictly necessary to establish the parameters of our deep dive here.
Yes, we need to be clear. We are examining Safi Kaskas' specific historical narratives and his interpretation of geopolitical events.
These are fiercely contested subjects. Walking through this specific historical narrative is like walking through a geopolitical minefield. Every single claim here is debated depending on who is telling the story.
Exactly. And our objective is just to impartially map his worldview and understand how he applies his theology to modern conflicts. We're not endorsing these historical claims, nor are we taking a position on the geopolitical minefields he discusses.
We are just reporting what's in the text. Because that distinction is crucial, the claims he makes are highly charged.
Extremely. For example, he traces the origins of modern extremism back to the Cold War.
Safi claims that the CIA actively trained Osama bin Laden and mobilized young Muslims in Afghanistan, utilizing religious rhetoric basically as a tool to fight a proxy war against the Soviet Union.
His argument is that this external intervention, this weaponization of theology, is what eventually morphed into the creation of al-Qaeda.
He also directly addresses the current conflict in Gaza.
Yes. Safi articulates a view that the political philosophy of Zionism needs to be, in his words, cleansed from Israeli minds.
He argues that replacing that specific nationalist ideology with the broader concept of being neighbors is the only viable path to lasting peace in the region.
Suggesting that political identities are the primary barrier to actual coexistence.
And to support his argument that peaceful coexistence isn't just some naive hope, but a historical reality, he draws on his own personal and regional history.
He recounts his childhood in Beirut, specifically noting how his family lived directly adjacent to the Jewish neighborhood.
He shares this memory of a Jewish neighbor coming to get him at the start of the Sabbath to turn on the synagogue lights.
Right, a practical necessity that required cooperation across religious lines.
And he expands the timeline even further, pointing to the Spanish Inquisition.
When Ferdinand and Isabella conquered the remaining Muslim territories in Spain, they issued an ultimatum forcing both Muslims and Jews to either convert or face expulsion.
And Safi notes that while many Muslims had routes to flee to North Africa, the Jewish population was largely stranded.
He highlights the historical narrative that the Ottoman Sultan, the leader of a massive Islamic empire, dispatched a fleet to rescue the Jewish population, offering them sanctuary and a safe place to live within Muslim territories.
Safi is utilizing these specific historical narratives to construct an argument against fatalism.
He's pushing back hard against the modern assumption that the Middle East is just destined for eternal, intractable conflict.
By emphasizing the Ottoman rescue or the daily cooperation in mid-century Beirut, he is arguing that the historical baseline of the region includes profound examples of different faiths operating as a country of neighbors.
He uses the past to argue that the ideological walls we see today are constructed and therefore they can be dismantled.
The integration of geopolitics with his translation work really reveals a cohesive worldview when you put it all together.
It does. He views the hoarding of theological texts by gatekeepers and the weaponization of political identities as two symptoms of the exact same disease.
They both rely on keeping people separated from the primary sources, whether that source is a religious text or just the shared humanity of your actual neighbor.
Which brings us right back to the core utility of a deep dive like this.
We exist in an era characterized by overwhelming information overload,
Oh, constantly. We are subjected to algorithms designed just to optimize for outrage.
And political sound bites that flatten complex, diverse populations into these rigid us versus them categories.
The antidote to that overload is returning to the primary source material.
Safi Kaskas' project demonstrates that when you actually read the foundational texts that dictate the behavior of billions of people, those artificial boundaries begin to look incredibly fragile.
You discover a shared, intense reverence for a historical figure named Jesus.
You discover a theological framework that values the hard work of making choices over the demand for perfect, flawless obedience.
You find that despite the agonizing complexity of modern geopolitical conflicts, the actual bedrock of these overlapping cultures contains a deep, shared desire to operate as a community of neighbors.
The differences are very real, but the commonalities are structural.
It really serves as a reminder to rigorously question the intermediaries who summarize the world for you.
When you bypass the commentary and examine the raw code yourself, you often find that the ideological walls demanding your allegiance were drawn by people who benefit socially, politically, or financially from your isolation.
That idea of bypassing the intermediaries leaves us with one final concept to consider.
Yeah, we discussed Safi's interpretation of the Garden of Eden earlier, not as the site of original sin, but as a workshop of choice.
He argued that the ability to make choices, to experience the friction of free will, is the exact mechanism that triggered human consciousness.
It is the defining feature of what makes us human.
The system requires the freedom to choose, the inevitability of failure, the awareness of that failure, and the subsequent course correction.
So here is a thought to mull over as you navigate your own week. If the ability to make choices is the very engine of our consciousness and our connection to the divine, how much of our modern pervasive anxiety stems from our frantic attempts to avoid making choices?
Think about it. We crowdsource our decisions, we allow algorithms to curate our tastes, and we freeze in the face of commitment because we are terrified of crashing the simulator.
But if that ancient workshop was designed correctly, avoiding the choice doesn't actually keep you safe.
No, it just prevents you from being fully human.
You have to take the controls, keep digging into the sources, and we will catch you on the next deep dive.